This is TAU Unbound, the English language podcast of Tel Aviv University. Please welcome your host, Ido Aharoni, Tel Aviv University's graduate, member of the Board of Governors, lecturer, writer, and veteran diplomat.
Welcome to our new episode of TAU Unbound. I'm Ido Aharoni, your host, and I'm really pleased to host today in the studio a long-standing acquaintance of mine, Professor Dr. Yael Strenhell from the Department of History, whose specialty is American Studies. Welcome to our podcast.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
It's such a pleasure to see you again and to spend some time with you and learn, first of all, about your own life experience, about your academic work, and of course, about your department and where you'd like to take the department in the future. So why don't we start with yourself? Tell us a little bit. I know you were born into an academic family.
Yeah.
Both parents.
I mean, my personal history is pretty straightforward in the sense that I come from an academic family. I was sort of raised into it. It's always been very natural for me to imagine myself as becoming an academic. But I want to say that one other thing that I got from my parents growing up is a real love for history and for the humanities and a fervent belief in the power of reading and writing to change the world. And so it's not just something that I always imagined myself doing. I really do have a passion for history and for the humanities that has always really burned in me. And I was ever so fortunate to be able to make a career out of it.
And your career started where?
So I did my undergraduate degree at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and then went on to get my MA and PhD at Princeton, where I had the great fortune of working with truly great minds, James McPherson, the renowned Civil War historian, and Daniel Rogers, the renowned cultural historian. And the reason why I chose this particular field, why I wanted to specialize in U.S. history and specifically in the history of the long Civil War era, partly derives from the fact that I spent some time in the U.S. as a child when my father was on sabbatical and was just indoctrinated into the American mindset. I'm a real success story of Black History Month, where I sort of first fell in love with this history and found it just so that it spoke so clearly and deeply to me.
Now, how many years did you spend as a child in the States?
Not many. I spent second grade and then part of 10th grade. So it wasn't, in terms of years, it doesn't add up to that much, but these were very formative periods in my life. We all have these times in our childhood that change us, that make us who we are. And for me, it was clearly the time that I spent in the United States as a child. In other ways, though, the reason that I ended up studying Southern history, Civil War history, I think goes even deeper and has to do with the fact that in some ways, for me, it's a way to process my own family's history in World War II, but in a setting that is less personal and in which I feel more perhaps secure emotionally. I don't have to work on the disasters and traumas of my own people, and I work on the disasters and traumas of other peoples, both white Americans and Black Americans. And in some way that is, I think, at the end of the day, the real reason why I ended up being a scholar of the American Civil War and its aftermath more than anything else.
For the benefit of our listeners and viewers that are not familiar with your own personal family history in Europe, why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, my father was born in 1935 in Poland and lost his father very early on in the war. And then entered his town's ghetto with his mother and his sister. who were taken to Auschwitz. He had the extraordinary good fortune of being placed with his aunt and uncle, who were able to take him out of the ghetto because his uncle had a work permit outside of the ghetto, and he received help from non-Jews, and they were able to make it through the war in a city that has been in the news in recent years, Lviv, where they converted to Catholicism, lived as Catholics, and got through. And in 1947, after it became clear that Poland was very unhospitable to Jews, even in the aftermath of the war, my father left for France, where he spent 4 years with a different aunt who had moved there in the 1920s and took him in. And he spent 4 years there in school, making up for the lost years of the war, where he could not go to school. And then when he was 16, migrated to Israel alone as part of a youth migration movement.
And as a survivor, what made him so unique, your father, the late Professor Zeev Sternhell, is the fact that he was such a staunch supporter and such a significant voice, supporting humanism and tolerance.
Right. So my father then went on to spend the rest of his life doing two things other than being an extraordinary father. One is to be a scholar of fascism. And he basically spent the rest of his life trying to understand what happened and what were the deep cultural forces that made his world fall apart when he was 4 years old. But then the other thing that he spent decades doing was trying to make Israel the kind of country that he could be proud of, a country that respects civil and human rights, a country that treats everyone as equals, a country that learned and internalized the lesson of Europe's great catastrophe. And he fought without fear, without hesitation, against Israel's control of the territories occupied in 1967. He fought for social justice within Israel. He was deeply committed to a set of causes that all of them basically came down to one fact, that we are all human beings and we all deserve to be free and happy. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, in the words of Thomas Jefferson. And he died 3 years ago at the age of 85, having really left a legacy, of course, both in my own life, but I think for Israel more generally, in terms of what it means to be an engaged intellectual and what intellectuals can do in society, what they owe to society. Lessons that I think resonate really powerfully, maybe especially these days.
So these are the foundations, your family foundations, also your intellectual foundation.
Yeah, in some ways that's true.
Led you to the study of
right.
what happened in the United States. So tell us first about your PhD. I'm curious to know about that.
Right. So my PhD dissertation, I started working on it when I was 28, which in hindsight seems very young, though I didn't feel young back then. But my dissertation was about the experience of spatial mobility in the Civil War. I basically made the argument that the most salient experience of living through the Civil War in the South, where the war was actually taking place, was not death or violence, but was movement of refugees, of runaway slaves, of soldiers. And I made a series of arguments about how the history of war is shaped by mobility, both in terms of how people experience it, but also in terms of how mobility shapes the contours of the war, how the war moves forward, so to speak, was through the movement of human beings.
Now, when you say mobility, if you can elaborate, what does it mean for our viewers?
So basically, we tend to think about war as happening either on the battlefield or on the home front. But the Civil War, as I argued in the dissertation that became a book, took place very much on the roads and the fields that connected the battlefield and the home front. Whether it is slave emancipation, which happened in movement. The way that slavery broke down in the United States was not through an armed revolt, but through the movement of hundreds of thousands of enslaved men and women who took the opportunity of the Union invasion into the South to flee their places of bondage, joined the Union Army, and had a tremendous impact on destabilizing the South, denying Southern slaveholders their labor, and encouraging the United States government to commit to slave emancipation. I also made an argument that the ways in which civilians who did stay at home experienced the war was through the movements of soldiers going back and forth, stopping at their homes. But even when they were not stopping at their homes, the way that women read movement fundamentally shaped how they saw the war. Did the soldiers move quickly or slowly? Did they have shoes or not? Were they retreating in disgrace, or were they marching into battle like heroes in the making? So the mental, the psychological experience of the cause of the desire to see the South winning was often translated into watching soldiers move and trying to make sense of it. I've also written about refugees, and we normally don't think about the Civil War as a refugee crisis, but it was. Both white refugees and then African Americans who, after having left enslavement, basically settled in refugee camps that were attached to the military camps of the U.S. Army, and suffered there from all the difficulties and the miseries of refugee camps as we had known them ever since. And so in that sense, the Civil War is a refugee crisis, and this is something that other scholars have really developed in the last few years. And we now really see it differently. We don't see the war as something that takes place in particular battlefields, but we see it as this all-encompassing crisis in which people are constantly on the move, and their movements destabilize the social order and eventually determine how the war is won and lost.
So the war is still impacting the implications of the war. The ramifications are still impacting American society until
Absolutely.
this very day.
I mean, in some ways, the United States is still debating the fundamental questions that were at the heart of the Civil War. Who owns America, or whom does America belong to? Is everyone who is in America and makes a claim on American citizenship deserve to be a citizen? Is America a white man's country, or does America belong to people of different colors, ethnicities, and backgrounds? In some ways, the debate about immigration is not that different in my mind than the debate about slavery, because it's a debate about who gets to be treated as a full-fledged human being and who can be tolerated as long as they're doing the labor that other Americans need from them.
And full access to opportunity, which is the big issue.
Exactly, and access to opportunity. I think that's absolutely true. The question of what is equality? Is everyone in America truly equal, and what does equality mean, is a question that is still, elections are still won and lost about this question. I mean, I think you can't understand the rise of Donald Trump in 2016 unless you see it in the context of a debate about what is the future of America, what kind of country will America be? Will it be a country that maintains particular privileges for white people, or will it be a country that will be truly inclusive and accept those who are already inside it and those who want to come in?
Now, we live in the age of information overload, which obviously contributes to polarization, flattens the conversation, lack of nuance. So where do you think America is going based on what you learned about the Civil War?
Look, I mean, I think, and this is not just my sense of it, but I think many of my colleagues and peers who study the Civil War era feel that America has not been this divided since the Civil War. And in some ways, the last few years have really felt like the 1850s, meaning a country in which two populations simply do not see the world in the same way and cannot even agree on the basics anymore. And the sense that the country is basically splitting into two: states where abortion is legal versus states where abortion is illegal, states that are addressing the climate crisis, whereas states that are not. That's in some ways that's a sort of a gradually dividing America that is not fighting a war. It is all mostly done nonviolently, though you could definitely argue that the January 6th insurrection was a form of violence that could absolutely seen as harboring or portending a civil war that could break out.
But to go back to your point about mobility, which I find I'm very curious to hear what you think about that phenomenon. So I understand the distinction between red states and blue states. However, it's very interesting that in some of the classic red states, let's say Texas or Georgia, you see all the major urban centers are actually blue.
Absolutely.
In Texas, the mayors in the larger cities have been Democrats for many years.
For a while, right. No, I think it's much more complex than it was 160 years ago. And even then, by the way, it was quite complex. Even then, there were regions within the South where slavery was not a major force, which regions where much of the population objected to secession and wanted to stay part of the United States and resolve the questions politically rather than militarily. So it wasn't that simple even back then, but it's definitely much more complicated now. And the urban-rural split in America is as salient and often volatile as the split between red and blue states. I think that's absolutely correct. But I think it's the last year or two have been a little calmer. But if we go back to how things felt in 2019 or 2020, there was a real sense that America. That armed militias, considering the fact that there are hundreds of millions of guns held freely by Americans, that we could quite easily imagine armed militias starting to fight each other on the streets of the United States. And again, in some ways, the January 6th insurrection was a moment of that sort, which ended quickly, but was transformative in many ways, because it really brought into sharp relief the possibility that political violence could break out on a mass scale in the contemporary United States.
Now, based on your knowledge and your experience, is there any hope for the American political center to be reinvigorated anytime soon?
I mean, that's a good question. Look, this is an age, I think this question is part of a larger question of can democracy withstand the onslaught of social media and the information overload and the changes in how we consume information and how we consume with our fellow citizens. And I don't know what the answer to that, and I wish I felt the answer was yes, absolutely. But I'm not so sure. I think human society is changing with technology, and democracy is uniquely vulnerable to the new ways in which human beings consume information and shape their understanding of the world. And so as long as Americans can no longer even agree on facts, and as long as Americans have sort of retreated into really speaking only with the people with whom they agree, and I'm not judging. I do pretty much the same in Israel, to be honest. Then I don't quite see how the center of the 20th century can be reborn or reinvigorated, as you said. I think we still don't know where this is going and whether we need to take proactive states as societies, as countries, to recreate other modes of communication, which will allow people who share the same country and have a mutual obligation towards one another communicate and hate each other less, honestly.
Well, there's an argument that the Constitution, which was written many, many years ago, was written in a different world. The technology was different. Everything was different. And it is very much like in the case of other, democracies. It's an inadequate document. You just mentioned the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment was introduced when it was a different America, and the needs were different. Do you think there's any chance of the American political system to have enough energy and power to adapt and adjust the Constitution to modern days?
Sadly, I just don't see it, and I agree absolutely that the U.S. Constitution no longer works. Sadly, that both the Electoral College and the Senate and the process of selecting judges, all of these processes, all of these institutions make no sense. In some ways, they never made any sense. And when the Constitution was written in 1787, it was written by a group of 55 men, not all of who, by the way, agreed to the system as it was ultimately conceived, but the majority of them did. And they had a vested interest in a particular type of government, and they had their own agendas, and they created a system that was in some ways intentionally undemocratic and allowed power to be held by particular centers or by particular actors within American society. And so we have a set of really crucial American institutions which are difficult to sustain, have always been difficult to sustain. But I think that the fact that elections are now becoming such fraught events in terms of the possibility that the Electoral College will simply not reflect the popular vote, that's a real problem in a democracy. That's a real problem. And so I think there are urgent repairs that need to be made to the Constitution. But in order to repair the Constitution, in order to amend it, you need 2/3 of both houses of Congress and the agreement of 3/4 of the states. And I, as an outsider observing the United States, just cannot see this, just can't imagine a scenario in which 3/4 of the states will agree to fundamentally alter the American system of governance, because too many states and too many populations benefit from the system as it now exists. And so in that way, I have great faith in American civil society. I think that we can't disregard the fact that America as a democracy has been solid and stable since the first election in 1788-89. And that's a huge accomplishment, which no other country can boast of. And I think that matters, that tradition and culture and a sense that democracy is who we are, that really does matter. But the way that the United States is organized politically is far from ideal, and honestly just completely out of step with contemporary politics in an age of mass politics, of polarization, of the information revolution.
Now, before we move to your current research, let's have a word about the Obama presidency, because I'm assuming that it has a very special and significant place in your vision of what happened.
Yeah. No, many people, Obama's election was one of the highlights of my life as a political being. And I was genuinely personally moved by it. But to be honest, and I'm actually on record on the morning after his election in Haaretz, in Israel's leading daily, saying that I don't know what this is all going to translate into in terms of African-American rights. And that there is even a way in which the election of a Black president could ostensibly show that African Americans have made it. And remember the lingo of the post-racial America. And that could be really harmful because African Americans are still really struggling economically. And the gaps between Black households and white households have not closed 1 inch in the past 50 years. I think the current rate is a Black household has 13% of the assets of a white household. And the election of a Black president doesn't really change that, to be honest. And the fact that Barack and Michelle Obama are just an astounding success story that is a great role model. And I think it does matter for, African-American kids who grew up during the Obama presidency, that it does matter. It does create this mental image of what a Black man and what a Black woman can be in America. But at the end of the day, if the same kids are still going to failing schools in neighborhoods that were intentionally planned by white urban planners to be marginal and isolated, if they don't have opportunity as children to really evolve into everything that they can be, then, the fact that Barack Obama was president is a happy fact, but it doesn't really make that much of a difference. And I think the last few years have sort of proven that that is actually the case. That in terms of the by all measures, there hasn't been a tangible change for the better in the state of the African-American community at large.
Now, before we started the podcast, we both talked about the importance of humanities in any academic institution. I myself graduated from the Faculty of Arts and Social Studies and your history. And I feel that, we're being attacked. There's an onslaught on humanities. And tell us, why do you think it's so important?
Look, I share your sense of an onslaught, and it's almost unfathomable to me that in the current state of the world, we need to justify why studying history is important. The world is undergoing vast transformations, whether it's the information revolution, whether it's the climate crisis, whether it's the democratic crisis. You can't expect people graduating out of a university to find themselves in this world unless they have some understanding of how the world works. You can't understand the reality that you live in unless you understand categories of gender, race, and class. You can't understand your own reality if you don't have any sense of how power works in society. And that is the kind of education that only scholars in the humanities and the social sciences and the arts can provide. What we are going to end up with is computer scientists who have no sense of what it means to be human and who think only in terms of very particular results to their research, who will create algorithms and AI technologies that could become honestly monstrous. And I think it is in some ways more important than ever that the humanities be given the place that they deserve in order to educate people who will be able to deal with these vast transformations in the life that we're all experiencing. The world is about to experience massive migration related to the climate crisis. We need to understand what it means to be a refugee. We need to understand how past refugee crises have been dealt with, how they have been resolved. We need to learn from the mistakes of the past in order not to end up, and I don't want to sound too apocalyptic, but with another Auschwitz and Hiroshima, because the processes of change that the world is undergoing are parallel to the same processes that it went through in the late 19th and early 20th century. And we need to reinvent democracy. How do you reinvent democracy in the age of the information revolution if your citizens don't know anything about the history of democracy, if they haven't taken one class in philosophy, in political philosophy, and they don't understand even what the system means, right? If the only thing that they consume are slogans that they're fed on Facebook and Twitter. And so I think, considering what a fragile and precarious and dangerous moment this is for the world, it is absolutely clear to me that we should all be invested in making sure that young people have the mental and intellectual equipment they need to deal with a world that honestly is not going to be an easy world to live in.
Well, we know we could talk about this for hours, but I'd like to end our podcast with this really call to action. Basically, what you just said is a call to action to our friends out there, our listeners and our viewers, to understand how important it is to support study of history and the study of humanities and social studies. And I would like to thank you for that. Our time is up, unfortunately, but I'd like to invite you again very soon to continue this conversation.
It was a pleasure. Thank you, Ido.
Thank you.
This is TAU Unbound, the English language podcast of Tel Aviv University. Please welcome your host, Ido Aharoni, Tel Aviv University's graduate, member of the Board of Governors, lecturer, writer, and veteran diplomat.